This is Heliox, where evidence meets empathy. Independent, moderated, timely, deep, gentle, clinical, global, and community conversations about things that matter. Breathe easy, we go deep and lightly surface the big ideas. You know that feeling? Just drowning in information sometimes. News feeds, articles, social media everywhere, and you just want someone to cut through it, give you the clear insights. Well, that's exactly what we do here. Today we're tackling something huge. It affects global trade, budgets, even the stuff you buy. Donald Trump's protectionist tariff strategy. It sounds complex, maybe even a bit confusing, right? But we're going to break it down for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Our goal here is to really unpack this. We're using our main source, tariffs. The fog is lifting on Trump's dubious tariff policy, plus some other key research. We'll look at the impact on places like Switzerland and China, understand the economic fallout intended, and, maybe more importantly, the unintended consequences for the U.S. and everyone else. By the end of this, you should have a really solid handle on how these policies are reshaping things and, fundamentally, what it means.
Exactly. Think of this as your shortcut to getting properly informed on a really critical issue. We've got some surprising details and clear explanations lined up. So let's start right at the beginning. This protectionist tariff strategy. What is it, really? At its heart, what's the basic idea?
Well, at its core, it's pretty straightforward. It's about using steep duties, basically taxes on imported goods.
Yeah.
The idea is to try and reshape global trade flows, the stated aims. Often things like reducing trade deficits, the gap between imports and exports, and generating revenue. Sometimes that revenue is pitched as a way to help fund the budget deficit without raising income taxes, for example. But what our analysis shows right away is a real tension. These policies hit key trading partners hard. They create a lot of geopolitical uncertainty. And as we'll get into, countries like Switzerland and China really felt the brunt of this.
Okay, so the aim is revenue, maybe fixing trade imbalances. But you're saying the sources immediately flag some, pretty big downsides.
That's right, yeah. Well, sure, the increased tariff money coming in is highlighted by supporters. The economic reality seems to be that it mostly burdens American consumers. They end up paying higher prices. And longer term, it can actually hurt U.S. companies that export. Maybe they face retaliation or their own costs go up. It's a key conflict within the policy itself.
It definitely sounds like it could create a very unpredictable environment. Our sources mention this shifting landscape, even maximum confusion for people in trade, for diplomats. Can you give us a clearer picture? How did this actually play out with specific countries?
Oh, absolutely. And the contrasts are really stark. You had President Trump praising deals, say, with the UK as a big win, or calling the EU deal the biggest ever. But then, almost in the same breath, a country like Switzerland gets slammed with these punitive tariffs. We're talking 39%. Just imagine you're an exporter there. You've planned everything, your supply chains, your costs, and then suddenly, boom, a decree changes everything overnight. That's the maximum confusion they're talking about. It's a nightmare for anyone involved in global trade.
Wow. Okay. And here's where it gets really interesting for me. The sources talk about contradictory statements, deals that are not legally binding. I mean, that sounds like a recipe for chaos in international relations, doesn't it? What does it actually mean for trusting these agreements? Are they just for show?
Well, what's fascinating, and maybe a bit concerning, is this underlying imbalance. The U.S. might raise its tariffs a bit on some things, but then expect partners to slash their tariffs way down and give major concessions. It's not always reciprocal in practice. And at the same time, you see Washington maybe giving temporary exemptions for certain goods deemed especially important, things like pharmaceuticals or maybe precious metals. For China, it might have been specific electronics for a while. But then they might turn around and push for much higher general tariffs on big categories, steel, aluminum, copper, maybe even pharmaceuticals later down the line. So it's this very dynamic system. Sometimes feels a bit arbitrary, keeps everyone guessing, keeps them on edge.
Right. So given all that back and forth, that uncertainty, what was the actual overall effect on the U.S. economy's openness to trade? Did the average tariff level really climb that much?
Oh, the data is quite clear on that. If you look at it on a trade-weighted basis, so adjusting for how much we actually trade with each country, U.S. tariff protection went up steadily. It started the year at about 2.4%, but by the end of July, it had hit 17.4%. And the expectation was it would climb further, maybe to around 20%, with really no clear ceiling in sight. What's really striking, and the sources really hammer this home, is the historical context.
Mm.
This isn't just tweaking policy. They say Trump is sealing off the U.S. economy in a way not seen since the Great Depression of the 1930s.
Wow. Sealing off since the Great Depression. That is a really jarring comparison.
It is. It really highlights the scale of the shift away from decades of generally increasing trade openness.
So who specifically ended up bearing the brunt of these, well, unprecedented hikes?
Primarily, America's biggest trading partners. Take China. Even with that 90-day truce from the Geneva trade deal, which did pause the escalating tariffs back in April and May, China still ended up facing a steep 40% trade-weighted tariff on its goods coming into the U.S. And our sources also mentioned earlier separate sanctions targeting things like fentanyl imports from China. So multiple layers there. And then you have Switzerland, as we mentioned, just catapulted, as the source puts it, from a pretty good position to a distinctly disadvantageous one.
Mm-hmm.
That 39% reciprocal tariff, widely seen as, frankly, absurd, pushed their overall trade-weighted rate to 20%. And that's even with about half their exports getting temporary exemptions.
Okay, so the impact is huge, especially on key partners. Now, President Trump often talked about this tariff revenue as a kind of tribute paid by other countries, right? But digging into the source material, what does it actually say about that? Is it really working as a major revenue source, or is that maybe oversold?
Right, and that's a really critical question. The sources directly challenge that narrative that it's other countries paying. In reality, it seems it functions largely as a tax on consumption. American consumers are the ones who ultimately bear most of that cost through higher prices. Now, are the tariffs generating money? Yes. Effective rates between 17% and 22% were bringing in substantial sums, maybe $350 billion to $500 billion. But, and this is the key point, that only covers about a fifth, maybe a quarter, of the massive U.S. budget deficit. As a percentage of the whole economy, it's only about 1.2% to 1.4% of GDP. So it's nowhere near enough to solve the revenue problem, the idea of balancing the budget this way. The sources call it an illusion, given the scale of the current deficits. So not solving the deficit, hitting U.S. consumers instead. But there's another angle the sources bring up, which sounds maybe even more concerning: tariffs used as a political weapon. Can you unpack that a bit? How does that work? Yeah, this is a fascinating perspective offered in the analysis. It suggests that decisions about tariffs aren't always purely economic. Sometimes they seem driven by, well, political whim. The source uses the phrase, the king in the White House deciding. Tariffs become a tool, punish one nation, reward another. And the examples cited are quite varied, maybe linking tariffs to fentanyl shipments, say from China or Mexico. Or maybe it's related to something like an unwelcome court case against a political figure, like former Brazilian President Bolsonaro. Or even responding to a lucrative offer, like Pakistan suggesting joint oil production. The result is this confusing patchwork of tariff rates we talked about. South Korea at 15%, Vietnam 20%, India 25%, but the UK gets 10%. Meanwhile, Liechtenstein, Germany, France pay 15%, but Switzerland gets hit with that huge 39%.
Yeah.
Just makes the geopolitical incentives really hard to figure out. It scrambles the usual logic.
That paints a picture of real unpredictability. Tariffs as a political tool, creating this messy patchwork. Okay, but what about the long-term consequences for the U.S. economy itself? Our sources draw an interesting comparison to India's past strategy.
Yes, exactly. This leads us right into the broader economic fallout. The analysis compares this protectionist approach to what's called import substitution, a strategy India used historically. The basic idea is to pressure companies, maybe force them, to produce goods domestically rather than importing them. Pharmaceuticals is often cited as a target sector for this. Now, historically, countries used import substitution to try and shield their new developing industries, protect them from foreign competition. But what often happened in practice, and India is a key example here, is that it led to domestically focused firms that weren't very competitive. They ended up producing lower quality goods, often at inflated prices, precisely because they were shielded from global competition. So the concern for the U.S. is similar. If less productive, domestically focused companies start competing heavily for workers and for capital, the worry is that overall productivity in the economy could decline. It might even hold back growth at the more dynamic, innovative firms, the so-called superstar firms.
Right, so trying to force production home might ironically end up making the economy less efficient, hurting innovation, and leading to higher prices or lower quality for consumers. That's a pretty stark warning from history. What about right now, though? Looking at the current U.S. economic numbers mentioned in the sources, are we actually seeing these impacts kick in yet? Or is it still too early?
Well, for the moment covered by the sources, the U.S. economy was still showing some resilience. There was still momentum from the AI boom, for instance. And interestingly, restrictive immigration policies were actually tightening the labor supply, which can prop up wages in the short term. Q2 2025 GDP growth looks strong at 3.0%, But there's a catch. Part of that growth might have been importers rushing to stock up on goods before anticipated higher tariffs hit, sort of a temporary bump. And the direct inflationary impact of the tariffs themselves hadn't fully materialized yet. Falling energy prices helped mask it, and other import prices weren't rising as fast as overall consumer prices. However, and this is crucial, the sources explicitly suggest these seemingly upbeat data are likely early signs of a downturn. They see trouble ahead.
Okay, early signs of a downturn. That caution makes sense. But this brings us to something else the sources highlight, something particularly, well, troubling regarding how we even know what's happening in the economy. What went on with the Bureau of Labor Statistics?
Yeah, this is a significant point raised in the analysis. It notes that the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, was fired quite abruptly, August 1st, just 6 months into Trump's second term. This happened right after her agency reported a drop in job creation numbers and, importantly, revised some earlier, stronger figures downward. And this occurred while the president was publicly insisting the economy was booming. There's even a direct quote mentioned from a social media post where Trump apparently blamed a Biden appointee, Dr. Erica McIntyre, for what he called faked jobs numbers, pointing to supposedly overstated growth figures from earlier in 2024.
Wow, so it's not just about the economic policy itself, but potentially about controlling the narrative, maybe even suppressing data that doesn't fit the story.
Yeah.
What are the risks there?
Exactly. The sources argue that the reported slowdown in job creation actually seemed quite plausible. It lined up with the general uncertainty over economic policies and the labor shortages caused by the immigration policies. So the core concern raised is about potentially shielding supporters from negative economic news by suppressing what's called politically inconvenient data.
Hmm.
And that's especially worrying because the BLS doesn't just report jobs numbers, it also reports consumer price trends, inflation, data that directly affects people's understanding of their own economic situation. It's a really chilling prospect for transparency.
Absolutely. Okay, so stepping back then, 6 months into the second term, according to our sources, what's the big picture? Where does the U.S. stand in the global trade system? And what does this all mean for the rest of the world and for us listening?
Well, the picture painted is pretty clear. The U.S. seems to be actively steering away from the established global trade system, the one based on multilateral rules like the WTO. Instead, the preference is for that patchwork of shifting bilateral arrangements we discussed. Deals made country by country, often seemingly on the fly. And the strategy involves high tariff walls rather than pursuing broader free trade. The assessment is that this approach will ultimately hit the United States hard economically, but it will also significantly impact others, especially Europe, and as we've seen, Switzerland seems particularly exposed.
Right. And the rest of the world? Are they just supposed to absorb this impact, just take the hit? Or are there strategies emerging, ways they might respond or adapt?
That's the crucial next chapter, isn't it? And the sources definitely point towards adaptation and response. They emphasize that U.S. allies are likely to look elsewhere, essentially turning towards other nations, other trading blocs, to reduce their dependence on what they perceive as an erratic United States. This helps explain, for example, the growing appeal of groups like BRICS Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and potentially others joining. It also explains why there's an accelerated search for alternatives to using the U.S. dollar for international trade and finance. The analysis suggests the best way for the rest of the world to mitigate the damage from U.S. protectionism is actually to integrate more closely among themselves, trade more freely with each other. That means strengthening their own trade deals, bilateral, plurilateral agreements. It means the EU reinforcing its own internal market. And perhaps counterintuitively, it could even mean the World Trade Organization gaining new momentum, maybe as a sort of WTO-1 block, the one being the U.S. if it chooses to stay outside the main framework. So it's really about pushing for global cooperation and building alternative networks in response to these isolationist tendencies.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've really unpacked how this tariff strategy, aimed at boosting revenue and bringing production home, actually ripples out in so many complex ways, affecting diplomacy, the economy, even the prices we pay.
Absolutely. And the analysis really underscores that while the U.S. actions are significant, they don't happen in a vacuum. The rest of the world's response, forging new partnerships, strengthening existing ties, will be critical in shaping how this all plays out. It will really define the future of global trade.
So here's something to think about as you go about your day. In a world that's become so interconnected, when one huge economy shifts its course this dramatically, what are the unexpected ripple effects you might start noticing? Months, even years down the line. How could this change the very fabric of global cooperation, maybe for decades? What stands out to you about how the world might adapt to this new reality? Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We really hope you feel more informed now, better equipped to understand the nuances of this incredibly important topic.
Thanks for listening today. 4 recurring narratives underlie every episode: boundary dissolution, adaptive complexity, embodied knowledge, and quantum-like uncertainty. These aren't just philosophical musings, but frameworks for understanding our modern world. We hope you continue exploring our other podcasts, responding to the content, and checking out our related articles at helioxpodcast.substack.com.